And many times I had never had the courage to read them. I have letters from my father from 35 years ago, 40 years ago, that I kept with me, didn't throw away.
Sally Field is one of the last living legends of Hollywood. But behind the trophies, applause, and iconic roles, her life has been scarred by tragedy.
I was replicating things in my childhood in the pattern that I couldn't get out of. I only recognized love if I disappeared.
At 78, her story is not simply one of stardom. It's one of heartbreak, survival, and resilience. From the shadows of her childhood to the silent battles of her later years, Sally has endured pain few could imagine. What truly happened behind the curtain of fame? Was Hollywood her escape, or was it part of the tragedy? Today, we uncover the hidden story of Sally Field's life. A childhood shattered too soon. For Sally Field, the story of tragedy did not begin in Hollywood. It began in the still, quiet corners of her childhood home. Born on November 6, 1946, in Pasadena, California, Sally entered the world at a time when her parents' marriage was already beginning to crack. By the age of 4, the foundation she thought was secure collapsed entirely. Her parents divorced, leaving her young heart splintered and uncertain. Divorce in the 1950s carried a heavy stigma, and for a small child, it meant not just separation, but the loss of stability, of certainty. Instead of a safe and predictable home, Sally grew up in the shadow of absence, a father often missing, a mother consumed by work, and a childhood that felt more like survival than innocence. Her mother, Margaret Field, was a working actress signed under Paramount Pictures. Glamorous on the outside, she was often distant on the inside, absorbed by the demands of her career and the need to maintain appearances. Sally's father, Richard Dryden Field, a decorated World War II veteran, was stern and remote, offering discipline but little tenderness. Their divorce left Sally suspended between two worlds, one glamorous but cold, the other authoritative but absent. The split didn't just fracture a household, it fractured a sense of belonging. For Sally, love and safety were not constants. They were conditions, fleeting, fragile, and unreliable. The true tragedy, however, came not from the absence of a father, but from the presence of another man. Not long after the divorce, Sally's mother remarried Jock Mahoney, a stuntman and actor whose charm dazzled outsiders but masked a darker truth. To the world, he was charismatic, adventurous, the kind of Hollywood figure who seemed larger than life. Behind closed doors, he became something else entirely. In her 2018 memoir, In Pieces, Sally revealed the devastating truth that had haunted her for decades. Mahoney had intimately abused her throughout her childhood. She described moments that no child should endure: his manipulative games, the way he blurred boundaries, and the way he exploited her silence. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It robbed her of trust, distorted her understanding of love, and left her with wounds that didn't bruise the skin, but tore through the spirit. What deepened the pain even further was her mother's silence. Margaret Field, the woman who should have been Sally's protector, failed to see, or perhaps chose not to see, what was happening in her own home. For Sally, the betrayal was twofold: the violation by her stepfather and the abandonment by her mother. In her words, she often felt like a child screaming on the inside, but no one was listening. That silence defined her early years. She was invisible in her own home, unseen in her own pain. But within that void, she found a strange, almost desperate lifeline: acting. To Sally, acting wasn't about fame, fortune, or ambition. It was all about survival. When entering into character, she could, for even a short while, forget herself. She could be someone who felt no fear and had no wounds. On movie sets along her mother's way, she saw actors express the truths reserved in her own home. She gravitated toward drama classes where she began to find out that acting was more than just a way to vent. It was her way out. Her initial roles were not a stepping stone to fame, but a means to breathe. Acting was her building ground, a fantasy world where she could finally express herself, even if through someone else's voice. That tiny spark of resilient life born of pain would soon lay the groundwork of her art. It was a late series of performances in which every interpreted instance of Sally Field, from Sybil to Norma Ray, bore the weight of that wounded child who had been silenced. But the fee for it was heavy. Stepping outside in performance, yet still carried scars. Her pain traced its way into her body, her relationships, and her career. The child learned to survive by being someone else and brought guilt into her adulthood. And as Sally's career began to burgeon, those pasts were anything but buried. Instead, it haunted her on Hollywood sets, a reminder that fame could never fully eclipse the shadows of her earliest years. But as Sally's career began to rise, her private pain didn't vanish. It followed her onto Hollywood sets. Hollywood's sweetheart, secretly breaking. By the time Sally Field reached her late teens, Hollywood had already begun to shape her into something she never wanted to be. In 1965, at just 18 years old, she landed her first major role in Gidget, a light-hearted sitcom about a carefree surfer girl. The role brought her immediate recognition, fan letters by the hundreds, and a warm, wholesome public image. For millions of viewers across America, Sally was the girl next door, bubbly, innocent, endlessly charming. And yet, behind that cheerful image was a young woman masking private scars and carrying the silent weight of a painful childhood. Acting, which had once been her escape, now became a paradox. It gave her visibility, but not the kind of voice she craved. 2 years later, in 1967, her career accelerated when she starred in The Flying Nun, a sitcom that quickly cemented her as one of television's most recognizable faces. Wearing a wide-brimmed nun's habit, she played Sister Bertrille, a quirky novice whose light weight allowed her to float into the air whenever the wind caught her headdress. To audiences, the show was a playful delight, full of harmless humor and innocence. To Sally, it was humiliating. Each episode felt like a reinforcement of everything she was desperate to escape. Roles that dismissed her depth, critics who saw her only as a cute face, and an industry that had no interest in her inner world. By the age of 19, the cracks in her public image had begun to show. Privately, she was collapsing under the weight of expectations. In later interviews, she confessed that filming The Flying Nun left her deeply depressed. She didn't want to wear a nun's habit day after day. She didn't want to smile when her heart was breaking. And she certainly didn't want her entire career to be defined by roles that stripped her of dignity and trapped her in stereotypes. At an age when most young women are still discovering themselves, Sally was being told by millions who she was supposed to be. That constant dissonance between the public persona and her private truth left her spiraling into self-doubt. She once admitted, "I was suffering so badly. I was so depressed. I was 19, and I didn't want to be playing something called The Flying Nun. I didn't want to be dressed as a nun all day long." The sitcom that made her famous had also broken her spirit. Sally Field was slowly coming apart at the seams under that smile. She was questioning not just her career, but also her identity. Would she forever be typecast in that demeaning stereotype, playing cheerful and light-hearted characters while hiding her pain? Or would she have the means to prove otherwise? At the peak of her sitcom fame, she did something that astounded many in Hollywood. She just walked away. For the next nearly 3 years, she refused all sitcom offers, thus jeopardizing her career at a time when there were very few opportunities for young women. The producers laughed and scorned. Sally Field had signed her own death warrant as a light actress who would never realistically carry a serious role. Industry insiders dismissed her, whispering that she would fade into obscurity as quickly as she had appeared. But Sally wasn't fading. She was fighting. She buried herself in the demanding world of method acting, training at Lee Strasberg's Actors Studio in the early 1970s. The work was grueling. It required her to face buried wounds, strip away artifice, and transform her deepest pain into emotional truth. Night after night, she pushed herself into raw territory, pulling from the darkest corners of her past. It wasn't glamorous, It wasn't easy, and it often left her questioning whether she belonged in the industry at all. Yet for Sally, this wasn't about ambition, it was survival. This radical choice nearly ended her career, but it also began to reshape her artistry. For the first time, she was no longer pretending to be a sitcom sweetheart. She was learning to become an actress forged by truth. To all appearances, an innocent girl set up for carefree enjoyments, she was seen in private preparing to show a very different kind of strength, pain, resilience, and courage. That choice nearly ended her career, until one daring role proved everyone wrong and launched Sally Field into a new era where she would finally be seen for the actress she truly was. Breakthroughs forged in pain. For years, Hollywood had doubted Sally Field. She was the cute surfer girl, the flying nun, the sitcom darling who brought in laughs but was never meant to carry serious drama. Yet in 1976, she silenced every critic with a performance so raw, so unsettling, that it left audiences shaken. That role was Sybil, the true story of a woman suffering from dissociative identity disorder, living with 13 distinct personalities born from childhood trauma. It was a role that terrified Sally, not because of its difficulty, but because it demanded that she open the darkest corners of herself. Each fractured identity Sybil embodied carried echoes of Sally's own wounds, her fractured childhood, her silence, her hidden pain. Night after night, she poured every ounce of herself into the role, embodying voices, mannerisms, and emotions that shifted in an instant. What the world saw as brilliant acting was also a woman channeling her own unresolved torment into art. The result was extraordinary. Sybil became one of television's most haunting dramas, and Sally Field walked away with her first Emmy. For the first time, the industry could no longer dismiss her. She had proven she wasn't just capable of drama, she was extraordinary at it. But Sybil was just the beginning. In that year of 1979, Sally undertook the role that does not only define her profession, but in many ways, her life. It was within that year that she played the title role in Norma Ray, the Southern textile worker who fought against injustices within the Union. More than a role, it was an echoing rallying cry. Sally did not perform, she lived the character. All that she brought to the screen, grit, determination, and vulnerability, felt all too real because it came from deep within her. This was not the flying nun. This is not anyone from Gidget anymore. This was Sally Field, a woman who has gone through pain, betrayal, and silencing, a history now put into a character so it can be heard. The film struck a nerve in the audiences because in Norma Ray, they did not see just a woman fighting for justice. They saw Sally, a woman who demanded to be taken seriously as she stood there on stage on Oscar night with her first Academy Award for Best Actress. It wasn't just a top honor. It was revenge upon every doubt, every dismissal, every whispered insult that she was not capable of greatness. She clawed her way past labels and typecasting, showing the world that the deepest scars can produce the greatest artistry. But with triumph came cost. Acting at this point of extreme vulnerability meant once again inflicting the very wounds that she had spent all her life trying to bury under a mound of awards, standing ovations, and a quiet question about how much more of herself could be offered after long hours of tiring performances and bouts with depression. Years later, Sally said in interviews that she frequently emerged from some of her best performances feeling so drained that she was forced to consider the consequences of what had just occurred. There was no shield on screen. The audience was treated to the raw, unfiltered truth of this actress. That honesty moved millions, but it also carved pieces out of her soul. To be sure, it could not deny her artistry. Hollywood finally gave her credit. No more the girly sitcom star, she had grown to be one of the most powerful actresses of her generation. She could take on the weight of real stories. The star of the late 1970s and 1980s, she materialized not just as a star, but one of authenticity herself. A life narrated quite differently than such a thrilling ascent in one's professional career would be for her an entirely different picture. It would undo as tragically as her off-screen life could manage the same ideals of love, family, and trust, which she had longed for, just as it undid outside her profession the battles she was so proud of winning. Yet, while Hollywood finally applauded, her personal life was unraveling in ways just as tragic, leading to heartbreaks and betrayals that cut even deeper than the industry's doubts. The heartbreak of love and betrayal. While Sally Field's career was reaching extraordinary new heights, her personal life was being tested in ways that revealed just how fragile love could be. Fame brought recognition, but it didn't protect her from loneliness, disappointment, or heartbreak. For Sally, the search for love became a long and painful journey, one that gave her moments of joy, but ultimately left scars that would follow her for decades. Her first marriage was to her high school sweetheart, Stephen Craig, in 1968. At just 22 years old, Sally was still finding her footing in Hollywood, fresh off the whirlwind of her early television fame. Marriage seemed like a safe harbor, a chance to build the stability she had been denied as a child. Together, they started a family, welcoming two sons, Peter in 1969 and Eli in 1972. For Sally, motherhood was pure joy, a role that filled her with a sense of purpose deeper than any script could provide. She often described her children as the anchors of her life, the one place where she felt unconditional love. But beneath the warmth of family life, loneliness crept in. The marriage was strained by distance, unmet needs, and the weight of her demanding career. By 1975, the relationship had quietly unraveled. Their divorce wasn't tabloid scandal, it was private grief. For Sally, it was her first painful lesson that love alone wasn't always enough to sustain a partnership. Just 2 years later, she stepped into a romance that would define and torment much of her emotional life, her relationship with Burt Reynolds. They met in 1977 while filming Smokey and the Bandit, and their chemistry was immediate, electric. To the outside world, they were Hollywood's golden couple, his rugged charisma matched by her luminous warmth. They lit up red carpets, smiled for cameras, and appeared to be a perfect match. But behind closed doors, the story was far more complicated. Burt Reynolds was the greatest popular figure, and yet, tragically, brought insecurity and later an overbearing behavior into the relationship. Sally eventually opened up that he would belittle her talent, undercut her ambition, and try to keep her in his shadow. When she was offered Norma Ray, the one that would win her an Oscar, he told her she wasn't talented enough. A dismissal that stung, even as she stood years later holding the Academy Award he doubted she could earn. Revenues had won the Oscar, but he was not there. Bird refused to go along with her at the Oscars in 1980, going into one of the biggest day-of-the-life moments alone. Theirs was a tempestuous union, hot lovemaking, followed by angry words and deep doubts. Sally confessed she was trying to show herself as enough for him, going through a constant cycle of lured loves combined with heartaches. That's how it ended in 1982. After about 5 years of being together, she just left it all. It wasn't a clean break, it was a tearing away, full of aftermaths. Burt would later, near the end of his life, admit that Sally was the love of his life. But for her, the damage had long since been done. She mourned not only for the man, but for all those years lost to a relationship that had left her with the impression that she was small and unseen. She found herself something calm, different. Married producer Alan Greisman in 1984. The marriage was different, steadier, quieter, and for a time it appeared to give Sally the kind of peace she had so long wanted. Sam, their son, was born in 1987, and for Sally, motherhood was again the shining light. Alan's stability was appreciated, but over time, that marriage began to fade too. It wasn't something out of drama, just that slow erosion of intimacy. In private, Sally found to have been alone in this different kind of ache love that couldn't last. In 1994, it ended in a covert separation for the two after 10 years together. Love left her scarred, but nothing prepared her for a near-death experience that would change her forever. The plane crash that haunted her. By the late 1980s, Sally Field had weathered heartbreak, the weight of Hollywood's doubts, and the painful unraveling of her most important relationships. But nothing, no betrayal, no rejection, no career struggle, could have prepared her for the day she came face to face with death itself. It was October 29, 1988, in Aspen, Colorado. Sally, her then-husband Alan Greisman, and their infant son Sam had boarded a private jet owned by television host Merv Griffin. The crisp mountain air carried no hint of danger as the family settled in, expecting an ordinary flight. Within minutes, ordinary became chaos. Just seconds into takeoff, the engines faltered. The plane lurched, dipped, and lost control before crashing into another aircraft on the runway. The sound was deafening, screeching steel, shattering glass, the thundering impact of metal meeting metal. Sally's body snapped forward, her seatbelt biting into her chest. She clutched her 11-month-old son with every ounce of strength, terrified he might slip from her arms. For a few agonizing seconds, she believed it was the end. The cabin filled with smoke and jet fuel, a suffocating haze that made it hard to see, harder still to breathe. In the chaos, she heard screaming, only to realize the voice was her own. Miraculously, they survived. Against every odd, Sally, Alan, and baby Sam walked away with only minor physical injuries. But survival did not erase the terror of those moments. Instead, it carved a wound far deeper than the skin, a wound that lingered in the form of fear, flashbacks, and guilt. All I was thinking was, "Hold on to Sam," she later recalled. She admitted she didn't care if her body broke in the crash as long as her child lived. When she realized he was unhurt, the relief was so overwhelming it nearly crushed her. But relief gave way to guilt. Why had they survived when so many plane crashes end in tragedy? What invisible hand had spared her family when logic said they should have perished? That question haunted her in the months and years that followed. Survivors often carry a peculiar burden, what psychologists call survivor's guilt, and Sally was no exception. She couldn't stop replaying the moment when the plane dipped, the shriek of the engines, the weight of her son in her arms. Each flashback brought back the same thought. This should have been the end. The experience changed her in ways which she could hardly articulate at the time. Publicly, she ignored it. She would not let the crash come to define her story. Privately, however, that event became a hinge in her life. Everything following the crash felt fragile, more sacred. The unending chase for Hollywood's applause was no longer that important, for she had faced death and been reminded of what matters: family, survival, and every breath received after death. But even as she rebuilt her life with gratitude, another battle waited quietly inside her body. Silent struggle with osteoporosis. By the time Sally Field entered her 60s, she had already proven herself as one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, a mother who had endured heartbreak but remained fiercely devoted, and a survivor of trauma who had transformed pain into purpose. But in 2005, another challenge emerged, this one quieter, invisible, and just as life-altering. During a routine checkup, Sally was diagnosed with osteoporosis, a disease that weakens bones and leaves them vulnerable to fractures. For a woman who had carried herself with so much resilience through life's storms, the diagnosis was a shock. She fit the profile perfectly: thin, small-framed, Caucasian, with family history of the disease. Still, hearing the words felt like a betrayal. "My bones were steadily thinning, and I didn't even know it," she admitted in an interview. There had been no warning signs, no symptoms she could see or feel. That was the most frightening part. The danger had been building in silence. For Sally, who had lived through so many visible struggles, this new threat was unsettling precisely because it was hidden. One bad fall, one wrong step, and her mobility, the independence she cherished, could be gone forever. But Sally Field was not the kind of woman to retreat into fear. Instead, she turned her diagnosis into a mission Determined to break the silence around osteoporosis, she launched the Rally with Sally for Bone Health campaign. She began speaking out publicly, urging women, especially those over 50, to get tested for bone density. In interview after interview, she repeated a message that became her rallying cry. Osteoporosis isn't something to ignore until it's too late. 1 in 2 women over 50, she warned, would suffer an osteoporosis-related fracture in their lifetime. Too many, she argued, didn't realize the danger until they were already living with broken bones and diminished lives. Some critics questioned the campaign, noting its ties to corporate sponsorships, but Sally never wavered. For her, it wasn't about branding, it was about advocacy. "I don't want anyone else to be blindsided like I was," she said. She used her platform, her fame, and her own vulnerability to push a conversation that too often remained in the shadows. By speaking openly, she transformed a private health challenge into a public mission, just as she had done with women's rights and LGBTQ+ equality. The diagnosis has changed her personal life. Now, Sally has started changing her daily activities with much experience of strength, balance, and mindfulness. She became almost entirely a plant-based eater, focusing on foods that help with bone health. Daily yoga in the morning made it easy for all her joints to flow freely while calming the mind. Walking is now ceremonious and just one of the actions helping her bones to become stronger without being pushed to extreme measures. Even if some early morning starts brought up stiffness or aches, they were not overly dragging, because when they came, they just meant that sync was no longer somewhere in the distance between the daily realities, but close to each day. At the same time, she would take such moments patiently, rather than denying them. Yet beneath the health battles, Sally's later years have also been about reclaiming peace and rewriting her own ending. Legacy, family, and final reflections. After decades of fame, heartbreak, and survival, Sally Field now lives in a way that feels like a long, gentle exhale. At 78, she has stepped away from Hollywood's relentless glare into the quieter rhythms of life in Pacific Palisades. Her home is not a showpiece designed to impress, but a sanctuary perched above the ocean. From her deck, the Pacific stretches endlessly, each sunset spilling gold and rose into the waves as though the sky itself is honoring the battles she has fought. Here, Sally has found what she once feared she might never hold: peace. Her life today is not measured by red carpets or film sets, but by the laughter of her family. Her 3 sons, Peter, Eli, and Sam, remain the center of her world. They are no longer children, but fathers themselves, and Sally delights in her role as grandmother to 5 grandchildren. To those closest to her, she is not Sally Field the actress, but Mom and Grandma, the steady presence who kneels in the garden with little hands planting flowers, who plays board games in the living room, who reads bedtime stories with the same tenderness she once carried onto the screen. The trophies on her shelf have long been outshone by crayon drawings taped to her refrigerator door. For Sally, these are the true markers of a life well lived. Her voice has lived on, and she has made it speak for herself. Her not-so-quiet years have turned her to petition even more strongly for things she believes in. In 2007, when her youngest, Sam, came out publicly as gay, he found her standing firmly beside him. That experience tightened her with a passion for LGBTQ+ equality, making her one of Hollywood's most vociferous allies. In 2012, she received the Ally for Equality Award from the Human Rights Campaign, where she delivered a speech featuring the same combination of vulnerability and resoluteness that defined her acting. Not as a star, but a mother determined to defend her child and every child deserving to live their truth. Her advocacy is not just for LGBTQ+ rights, but for women's reproductive rights, which she has fought for based on painful memories as an adolescent, to present to women their right to choose for themselves. She has marched for climate causes with Jane Fonda in 2019 even risking arrest for amplifying her voice on what she calls an urgent cause. Unlike many retreat in their later years, Sally has continued to fight, her activism being a natural corollary because of the resilience that has sustained her through every personal storm. In 2018, she published a deeply emoistic reflection on her life, In Pieces, which she now considers no more than just a testimonial, revealing those truths she used to hide. The abuse endured while a child, the broken heart throes of love, the self-doubt that shadowed even the greatest of her triumphs. Writing it was not about getting back into headlines, but about giving her younger self the voice she never had. "It was a gift to the little girl I used to be," she explained. For her fans, it was far more than that. It was the gift of honesty, a reminder that even those with the perfect lives tend to hide invisible wounds. Sally Field's life at 78 is marked by both heartbreak and resilience. Her story forces us to ask, how much pain can one person endure and still find the strength to keep shining? What part of Sally Field's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you were moved by her story, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and don't miss the next video on screen for more untold stories of resilience and legacy.